Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. This week's episode is extremely unique. Without a doubt, it is the most powerful interview that I have ever conducted on this podcast. You know, I'm a big believer that life hands you lessons if you're open to seeing them and accepting them. And I'm just going to give you a heads up that this is one of those times. I want you to take just a second right now to think about your loved ones. Think about your siblings, your parents, your kids, grandkids, close friends, all of the people in your life that you love. And I want you to keep those people in mind as you listen to this interview. Now, I'm going to warn you, it is extremely difficult content, and you may feel tempted at one point or another to block things out or to stop allowing it to relate to your own life. But I urge you to keep your heart open and to really listen to this woman's story. And I want you to think about it in the context of your own life. So I would like to introduce you to this week's guest. I recently had the incredible honor of interviewing a woman by the name of Gerda Weissmann Klein. She is a humanitarian, an author, a human rights activist, a Holocaust survivor, and a proud naturalized citizen of the United States. She was born on May 8th, 1924 in Bielsko, Poland. And in 1939, her life changed forever when German troops invaded her hometown of Bielsko. From 1939 until the end of World War II, she lived in fear and deprivation. After being separated from her brother shortly after the invasion and from her parents in 1942, she worked in slave labor and concentration camps until she was forced to walk in a 350-mile death march. She never lost the will to live, and when World War II ended in 1945, Gerda was left homeless and without any family or friends. And despite all of that, and everything that she lost, she found a fairy tale ending when she married her liberator, U.S. Army intelligence officer Kurt Klein. 2 years after she immigrated to the United States as Kurt's wife, Gerda became an American citizen. For more than 6 decades, Gerda Klein has captivated audiences worldwide with her powerful message of hope, inspiration, love, and humanity. In her speeches and books, she draws from her wealth of life experiences, from surviving the Holocaust and meeting her future husband on the day of her liberation, to her journey to the United States, where she raises her family and has fought to promote tolerance and combat hunger. The story of Gerda and Kurt's meeting and their life together is documented in her autobiography, All But My Life, which has been in print for 53 years in 62 editions and has been read by countless students around the world. All But My Life is the foundation for the documentary film One Survivor Remembers, which was produced by HBO and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The film won the 1995 Academy Award for Documentary Short Subject and the 1994-95 Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Information Special. In 1998, a public nonprofit foundation, the Gerda and Kurt Klein Foundation, was established to honor the Klein's mission to promote tolerance and community service through the creation of 2 nationally recognized educational programs. On November 17, 2010, President Obama named Gerda Klein, as well as 14 other incredible individuals, as recipients of the 2010 Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. Well, everyone, I am so incredibly honored to welcome a wonderful woman to the podcast today. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from Gerda Weissmann Klein. So welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, April, and I certainly am looking forward to our conversation. It's very kind of you to want to hear a part of my story.
So let's start at the beginning. I want to hear about you as a child. What was your early childhood like?
I think it was very blessed. I had marvelous parents and an older brother whom I adored. And I played with cats and dogs because we always had a lot of animals. And looking back, I think my childhood was quite ideal, even though when I look a little deeper, I see it perhaps I had some difficulties for my being Jewish. You always had to be sort of not ruffle the waves, you sort of have to be always a little more cautious to be a good girl and not to embarrass your parents or what have you.
How did you spend your days as you were growing up?
Well, if we're talking of early childhood, then of course it's, going to school and, as I said, playing with my friends. And I love to swim and I love to ski. I was not a great athlete, but I enjoy those things. And as I said, reading has always been the greatest joy of my life.
Moving ahead a little bit, we're actually jumping ahead, I think, quite a bit, but I'm curious about initially as the war broke out, what were some of the first things that you started to notice? You talked about your day-to-day life as a younger child, and it all sounds very normal and it all sounds familiar to all of us, likely as we think back to our own childhoods. I'm curious about how life changed when the war broke out.
Well, it changed drastically on the very day. There was not a change that you need to observe. It became immediately dangerous for the fact that we were Jewish, which of course I never considered that it was dangerous. The men had to be, as a matter of fact, they right away gathered a number of Jewish men and put them in the temple. The temple was burned. So you can imagine the shock of that, It's a few days before you were fairly free and everything, and now suddenly this becomes a matter of life and death.
I can't even imagine how shocking that must have been. When I think about aspects of myself that I take for granted, it's just such an arbitrary one that all of a sudden this piece of you is a dangerous thing to have, and who you are is dangerous to be. That would be really, really jarring.
Absolutely. It came like overnight. It became immediate.
So you talked a bit about how life really drastically changed as the war broke out. One of the things that I saw in a previous interview that you had done, you'd talked a bit about what it was like the day that the Germans invaded your town. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it's extremely painful, I will tell you this, because, suddenly from day to day, something became entirely different, We were concerned, particularly men were taken away almost immediately, and within a few weeks, my brother was taken away, and he was my older brother I looked up to, and he fought my battles for me, when I was a little girl. One of the first things that happened, they came and requested the Polish flag. The Polish flag is, red and white, and they made a Nazi flag of that immediately, and that started, first we saw they were flying from neighbors' home, and pretty soon they came for our flag. They told my brother he has to go and put it on top of the roof, which of course was an extremely painful thing, and we were no longer really safe in our home. We had to wear the Jewish star immediately, and it was, you had to wear it on your chest and your back, and if you wore a hat or something, then on top of it. So you became immediately recognized of who you were, and, anybody could stop you or slap you if they so wished. Then we were given the ration stamps for food, and of course ours were, just a minimal part of what other people got.
You mentioned a little bit about when your brother was taken. Can you tell us a little bit about the night that happened, or the day that happened?
I'll be honest with you. The loss of my brother has been the most difficult one, and so that happened in 1939. I find it very difficult to talk about it because I'm thinking of my brother every single day of my life.
Yeah.
So needless to say, when my brother left, and of course I had no idea that I'll never see him again, he told me to take care of our parents. And, he was 18, almost 19, and I was 15. And I always thought that this was my most sacred vow, and tried to do it for my brother, and dreamt that one day he will tell me that I did a good job. Unfortunately, that day never came. I never saw my beloved brother again.
You know, it's impossible to hear you, talk about that with your brother and not think about, my own situation. And I have a younger brother, and we're extremely close. And when you put a story like yours into the context of real life and the fact that, it happened to somebody who had real relationships and normal relationships with their, parents and siblings and friends, it makes it that much heavier when you think about it happening to, your own family. It would be incredibly painful.
Thank you. You understand quite well, so I don't think that I need to say much more about that relationship.
After your brother left, I know that you were eventually separated from your mother and your father as well. And I can't imagine how painful that must have been. Is there anything about that story that you would be open to sharing with us?
In all honesty, I cannot put in any words, no matter how eloquent, of what the feeling was like. And I was particularly close to my father. Mm-hmm. And I saw my father the last time on the 28th of June, my mother on the following day. And of course, I didn't realize then that was forever. Well, as I said, my father was taken the day before, and story had it that he went to an adjacent place where they were building something on a waterfront. Of course, it was a lie. And my mother, when we were holding hands, when the master of life and death stuck us between our hands, and my mother went one way and I another, I did not realize that they took my mother to the train. It was all at the train station. And we young girls were put on the truck. And then I heard my mother's voice calling, "Where to?" And I answered, "I don't know." And my mother said, "Be strong." Those were the last words, that the echo of which I heard from my mother. Later found out, because the Germans were very good in writing about everything, that my mother was sent to Auschwitz, and that she was killed the following day. And if that could be a comfort that she did not suffer long, then you can imagine the type of times there were if this becomes a comfort.
I'm so sorry that you had to lose your parents in that way.
And looking back now, my mother was only 43 years old. Now I have grandchildren at that age.
Gerda's mother was put on a train, and she was put on a truck. And when Gerda realized that she was being separated from her mother, she jumped off the truck.
There was a man by the name of Marin who was helpful in taking care of the type of separation. He lifted me bodily and threw me back on the truck, and he said, "You are too young to die."
The train that Gerda's mother was put on was sent to Auschwitz, and she was killed the very next day. In some ways, Gerda's life was spared by the man who separated her from her mother. So where did you go that day? They put you and a lot of young girls on a truck. Where did they take you?
We went to an adjacent city, which was called Sosnowiec. And there they had something called Durchgangslager, which meant a place which was a temporary place. And industrialists from all over Germany came to buy slaves. And in my case, the city in which I was born, which was called Bielsko, was famous sort of in Central Europe for textile factories. So one day, obviously, someone from a textile center in Germany called Kramstermaker came and bought us, simply for some reason that we will have more aptitude for weaving. Of course, I know nothing about weaving. But the very fact, of course, that we were German speaking, helped us survive. If you did not speak German, they often just went straight to Auschwitz because you were not of much help. And in my case, what probably saved my life is the fact that I spoke German. And so consequently, we were sold.
Something that you touched on a little bit in an interview that I saw you do, it was probably, I think you were in your 70s at the time. You mentioned in that interview that there was an incredible support system within the work camps and the concentration camps that people were taken to. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because that is not something that I've heard in any history books or other places where we've learned about the Holocaust.
Oh, that was the only thing, that made you want to go on, is the type of concern and support that you got, from other girls.
One of Gerda's best friends was a girl by the name of Ilse, and one very famous story involving Gerda and Ilse was when Ilse found a single raspberry while she was out working one day in the camp, and she carried that raspberry back to Gerda in her pocket. She carried it all day long so that she could give a single raspberry to Gerda.
A friend of mine who found a raspberry in the gutter, carried it in her pocket all day long to give it to me that night. One single raspberry, her entire possession, and she would not let me share it with her. She says, "No, you eat it." This was my friend Ilse, who unfortunately passed away in my arms a week before the war ended.
So she gave you the one single bright spot that she could find that day. She carried it around and brought it back for you.
In her pocket, only God knows against what temptation. Yes.
I think it's, I said there's so much that you learn growing up about the Holocaust and the war and everything, but you don't hear about that side of it where, there was such a support system and that there actually was some laughter and joking and friendship. You don't hear about those parts of it.
But I think that this is what we should address too, and this was the support system, that you could laugh, that you can make jokes. And, we did in a couple of days that we were free, the first camp, to do plays. I used to write plays. And I always feel that those were the moments, when you could see somebody laugh. And for some people, perhaps it was even the last time that they laughed. But those are the memories that sustain you, in a way.
You said you wrote plays. What were your plays about?
Well, one of my plays was about my friend Ilse and I being two grandmothers. And then, of course, we talked about our time in the camps and, when our two granddaughters came and listened to us for a while, and they dismissed it and say, "Oh, let's go and talk about our boyfriends. You know how old people exaggerate." And, the times when we were 16 and 17, that we could go forward and think in times that our children and grandchildren will not believe our tales. That was very comforting, that there will be such a time. And as a matter of fact, whenever unfortunately, not too many people survived, but one person with whom I'm in touch with, she played my granddaughter in the play, and we talk about it occasionally now, about her grandchildren, my grandchildren, when, how incredible it is that, when we fantasized about that it actually turned into reality.
I just thought that was incredible when Gerda talked about the plays that they created, because she had this incredible fantasy at that time in the middle of a horrible, horrible situation. Her fantasy was to have children and have grandchildren. And, that's one of those very normal things that so many of us take for granted. And for her, it was just the ultimate fantasy. And flash forward to where she is now, it is just one of the sweetest things to get to know that, she was able to experience that. She made it through that awful situation, and she was able to have children of her own and grandchildren. You were in a number of, I know from the research that I did that you were in a number of different camps. And I think the last one you were in was called like Grunberg or something like that.
Yes, that's right. That was the worst. Yeah. It always got worse each time because, at first, because we worked on looms and what have you, and things used to be a little easier, if there was raw material. And, we had to work. They gave us a little more food because they needed our strength, in our work. And as things became worse in Germany, of course, they became much worse for us as well. So, it was sort of a catch of something,
Mm-hmm. One of the most atrocious things about the Holocaust was these events basically called death marches, where essentially toward the end of the war, the Nazi Party needed to get rid of the rest of the Jewish people, and bullets were too expensive. They couldn't afford to kill them that way. And so they needed to find a way that was more economical to get rid of a lot of people. And that's where the death marches came from. And Gerda talks to us a little bit about her experience and what that was like.
Well, to begin with, the march started for the simple reason that they felt, because the British and Americans were advancing and, it looked as Germany might lose. Consequently, they had to get rid of us. And believe it or not, but bullets were too precious for the front. So they had to find ways in which to kill us. And this is when they put us on the death march. To Greenberg came a couple groups of other girls. And finally, we were 4,000 girls that started that march. And that was on the 29th of January, 1945. At its conclusion on May 7th, there were fewer than 120 left from the 4,000. I think one thing, of course, you needed to have an enormous amount of luck, which obviously I had, and a very good physical constitution. And my father made me wear, when I left home, which was in June, my father asked me to wear my skiing boots. And I said, Papa, skiing shoots in June, I would have walked away in a pair of sandals. And my father said, I want you to wear them. And of course, you did not argue with your father. Mm-hmm. And I do believe that having those boots in the winter and on that long walk, they were really instrumental in saving my life.
Your dad was a smart guy.
Yeah, he sure was. As I mentioned, from when we started in Greenberg and we finished the march in Bolarico, Slovakia. less than 120 girls surviving from that enormous number.
And your friend Ilsa, the wonderful friend who brought you her raspberry, was one of the women who passed in that march.
Ilsa died exactly a week before liberation, yes.
It's actually kind of crazy to be sitting here today talking to somebody who survived it.
Believe me, it's crazier for me. I'm sitting in my son's home in Washington, looking out the window and looking at some of the shelves with my grandchildren's pictures, wedding pictures and baby pictures and what have you, and to talk to you about those days, you know.
It's a pretty big contrast.
Yes, indeed it is. You know, it's all the thing I can say. If you say, well, the next time we will meet is on the moon, it's not likely, but people have gone to the moon. But to have been where I have been and to be sitting now here, with my son next to me, to talking about things, believe me, it's much more fantastic and unbelievable.
Gerda's death march ended at an old bicycle factory where she and the other 120 girls who had made it that far were locked up. And this was the scene of yet another time that Gerda escaped death.
Well, on that day, we had American planes overhead. We knew that liberation is probably close, but we never thought that we will know the joy of freedom because they took us and locked us into an empty factory, a bicycle factory, and attached a time bomb. I know it sounds like a cheap thriller, but this is what happened.
Wow.
And I remember we were praying that some miracle should happen. And indeed it did happen. It started to rain, a torrential rain started, which we later learned, started in mud, which prevented the bomb from going off.
And after all of those years, and after all of the adversity that she had experienced, Gerda's Liberation Day had arrived.
In any event, it was, when the bomb didn't get off and the Czech people started opening the doors. I remember standing in the doorway, and then seeing a strange vehicle coming down, and thank God it had on its hood not the swastika, but the white star of the American Army. That was the brightest star that I've ever seen in any sky.
Did you realize at that point that you were safe?
Well, it is like a miracle, yes. We know that, the Nazi vehicle was here just not long ago, with the swastika on its hood. And here was the American Army.
And not only was that day Gerda's Liberation Day, but it was also the day that she first met Kurt Klein, the man who would become her husband.
And, of course, the greatest moment of my life was when later on one of the Americans came up to me and asked me if I spoke English. I said, no, I speak German. And I said, yes. And he said, may I see the other ladies? You can imagine, as what we were addressed, to be addressed as ladies. And I remember, I've been unwashed and in rags, and I weighed 68 pounds. And the American said to me that he wanted to see the other ladies. And so he opened the door for me and let me proceed. And in this gesture, he restored me to humanity again. And the greatest thing about that is that this young, handsome American lieutenant became my beloved husband. People used to say to him, was it love at first sight? And he said, yes, it was love at first fright.
Love at first fright. I cannot even describe to you how much I adore this woman. And what's incredibly amazing about this is at this point, you've heard the part of her story where I think people would think, really, that's her story. That's where it ends. But Gerda really, it didn't end there. She really thought about the adversity and the experience that she went through. And that experience changed her, and it set the course for what she would do with the rest of her life and the responsibility she felt for having survived when so many other people didn't.
None of my closest friends survived. My friend Susie died on Liberation Day. I found her near the pump. And I tried to get some water. And there were four of us, and my friend Lisa, unfortunately, had been struck by a bullet, and she died a few days later. So the four of us, the closest, we marched together. And I remember I had a cold, and they said, well, if you could just get rid of your cold, and they were dragging me. And yet I'm the only one of the four who survived. And of the many others, from the 4,000 girls, there were 120 survivors. It's unbelievable. And of course becomes the question, why me, So you ask the question, why am I here, And if I am here, what is my responsibility?
Gerda took that responsibility extremely seriously, and she devoted her life to sharing the story of what happened to her and her friends and so many other people during the Holocaust. One of the ways that she did that was through writing her memoir, a book called All But My Life. And she tells us a little bit about that book.
It is now in its 72nd printing.
That's
so it
amazing.
Has done extremely well, I still get an enormous amount of mail because the book is in high school textbooks. So,
Wow.
Young people are really marvelous. And when people say that our young people are not, very much involved, that is not true. I get the most wonderful letters from young people who are very caring and concerned about freedom and all the things which we hold so dear.
That has to be so gratifying to you to know that you went through this experience and this horrific situation, and you've been able to put it out there, and it's truly impacting the lives of people who, would never be able to hear that story firsthand.
Indeed it is. And, so many years old, but my life was published in 1957. There is not a week that I don't get a number of letters concerning the book. And the university in Phoenix is now keeping it, as well as Chapman University. Thousands of letters of young people. So our young people are very concerned, and I am really very admiring of our young people's concern and sensitivity to freedom and things.
That's amazing. Oh my gosh. That just warms my heart to know that not only is it touching this next generation of kids, but that they are taking the time to reach out and write to you. I think that's amazing.
Absolutely.
Gerda shared with me a little bit about her passion for making sure that she teaches our next generations about the importance of freedom and what it means to live in the United States and to be free in a country like ours.
but to know the preciousness of freedom and, what it is like to live in the United States, to be an American citizen.
Mm-hmm.
I believe I might have mentioned it before that I've always said, the most precious thing in my life is my family. And the second is my American passport. And that we need to work diligently and teach our children, grandchildren, and in my case, great-grandchildren, the greatness of this country, and to see that we can preserve this freedom and teach it to others. But this is really what it's all about. That has been, in a way, the mission of my life, to tell of the horrors, to appreciate freedom, to teach it, to be grateful that we are where we are, because we are very blessed.
If you're not already completely impressed and enamored with this woman, I have to share one story from our conversation that day. The content that I went over with Gerda and the questions I was asking her and her answers, they're extremely heavy. And, there's a lot of emotion and it was really difficult, to ask about and to have her talk about. And all the while, at one point in the middle of our conversation, she told this hilarious story of how, when she was sold essentially as a slave at the beginning of the Holocaust, with the exchange rate and everything like that, essentially she was bought for about $3.50. That was what her life was worth at the time. And going forward, her story and her life was made into a documentary. And that documentary won an Emmy and it won an Oscar. And if you actually search, and I'll put a link on her show notes page to her Oscar acceptance speech, you can see Gerda accept her Oscar, except she wasn't actually supposed to speak that day. It was supposed to be the producer of this documentary who was going to give the Oscar acceptance speech, and that was going to be the end of it. Well, of course, the producer gives the speech, the music swells, and, everybody's supposed to walk off the stage, but Gerda felt like, well, man, it would be really rude of me to not say thank you when somebody has given me this amazing award. So she hops up on the podium and she gives the most amazing acceptance speech with the most moving words that I think I've ever heard in an Oscar acceptance speech. And they let her give her speech because, of course, she's this incredible woman who's been through this incredible thing. Now, come to find out, she found out after that event that the amount of time that she spoke in the Oscars was essentially about $2 million of airtime. So as all of this content is getting, and her story is getting super heavy and really emotional, she pauses to make sure that I can kind of laugh in the middle of this to tell me how much her life has become worth so much more over time, because she went from $3.50 to $2 million in just a few moments of Oscar airtime. This woman is just incredible. I cannot say enough amazing things about her. Before we wrapped up in her interview, I asked her the same last question that I ask every single woman on the podcast, and I asked her to give us her favorite song. So here is Gerda Weissmann Klein's very favorite song.
God bless America.
Oh, I love that. I love that so much.
No, thank you for doing it. And it's wonderful of you, as a young person, to care so deeply to do that. So God bless you and God bless America.
I titled Gerda's episode, The Responsibility of Living. She so eloquently spoke about the sense of responsibility she felt because she was alive when so many other people weren't. Let that sink in for a second. Shouldn't we all feel the same sense of responsibility to some degree? You, the person listening to this, you're here. You're here right now. And with that comes the responsibility for making the most out of the time that you have left, expressing love, giving back, being just a little bit fearless. Now, I'll be completely honest. I walked away from this interview a totally different person than I was before I had the pleasure of meeting Gerda. Basic things like love and family and freedom are really all that matter. If you were as moved by Gerda's story as I was, I highly suggest you read her book, All But My Life. It is so incredibly powerful, and it does justice to the story that I couldn't get into in the short amount of time that we had on this podcast. I also urge you to check out her website, www.citizenshipcounts.org. And last, go check out Gerda's Oscar acceptance speech and watch that incredible woman school a room full of Hollywood stars on what it really means to be a winner. She is just incredible. I really hope you enjoyed meeting Gerda Weissmann Klein. I hope her story means as much to you as it does to me, and if it does, please share this with other people in your life. Now go be brave and have an inspired week.